Hello, and welcome to We Make the Road by Walking, an exploration of people's paths and how they got to where they are and where they might want to be, brought to you by City of Bridges. And it's me, Randy Bartlett, and we have a guest with us today. All right, hello. So I'm here with Mac Howison, and I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and then ask our questions. So, hello, welcome, Mac.
Thank you, Randy. My name is Mac Howison.
Yeah.
I'm a program officer for creative learning at the Heinz Endowments. That's what I currently do now. I'm also a father of two lovely young children who aren't that young anymore.
Not so young anymore, yeah.
And a husband, and an avid runner and outdoor enthusiast, and just sort of lover of being in the city of Pittsburgh.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for taking a few minutes to hear about your path. So when people ask you what you do, how do you answer them?
Well, what's funny, I guess the answer to that is it's a little bit mundane or a little bit jargony. To start with, I'm a program officer at a private family foundation. But what I like to think of, and what I'd rather tell people it is that I do, is that I help to provide, to use my position to provide resources for community improvement projects, basically, primarily working in the space of education and learning and elevating the arts as a vehicle for really young people learning to express themselves and to become more whole people. So if the moving of money through a grant-making foundation can do that, I'm happy to play a role in that. So fundamentally, I'm a program officer at the Heinz Endowments, but I think we do a lot more. Mm-hmm. And really, as an organization, I'm also a part of a team, and that team is really concerned with creating a more just and equitable region, and we do that in a variety of different ways. My role in that is really to work in the arts education space.
Wonderful. It's important work. So what was your path to where you are now? How did you get here?
This is always a fun story to tell, and I don't know how much time we have. I'll try to make it abbreviated, but I really, I grew up being a pretty independent, sort of outdoors exploring kind of person, but loved time that I spent with my friends. And I grew to really prioritize visual art and theater as a young person, and I think I always aspired to be some kind of producing artist. Went to school for fine art, drawing and painting, but I was never really able to professionalize that as a career. But I maintained a practice, really got more interested in rock and roll music and playing the electric bass, and so actually for a number of years when I was younger, took a lot more seriously the idea that I might actually make it as a rock and roll musician. Of course, that's a young man's fantasy.
Right. Many of us had that dream.
It didn't exactly pan out, but I had a lot of fun along the way. Started a family when I was pretty young, so did a number of things to support that family. I was a lighthouse tour interpreter on the Oregon coast at one point, which was kind of an accidental kind of opportunity that I had when my child was first born. I spent a number of years working at the East End Food Co-op, so I got some experience both in kind of the labor of running and working in a grocery store, but also some of the management issues associated with a cooperative facility, and a cooperative during a particularly interesting time in Pittsburgh when Whole Foods opened up, and there were a number of labor and kind of communal economic issues around natural foods at the time, and I was kind of at the center of that and having learning all along the way, because certainly that was not a career I set out to do, but I spent about 7 or 8 years there. I had a great opportunity through some of my community work that I maintained in the arts to get a foot in the door with an organization called the Sprout Fund, and the Sprout Fund really became my growth as a career person. The primary purpose of the Sprout Fund was to create a vehicle through small scale grant funding and support to build out networks that connected young people, mostly 18 to 40-year-olds in the region, with opportunities that they could engineer themselves. And so kind of creating a new culture in Pittsburgh and supporting an emerging culture of young people who actually wanted to stick around here. I did that for about 13 years and practiced in many ways not only the craft of grant making, which was ultimately the vehicle that we used at the Sprout Fund for getting some of this community engagement underway, but actually more so interactions and relationships in community, learning about the many different characteristics of residents in all of the different neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, and really thinking about how to empower both young people and community residents of all ages to take more of an active leadership role in their own, kind of in their own backyards. That work continued for a number of years and did eventually position me to, when an opportunity came up at the Heinz Endowments, specifically in the arts and culture space. I was eager to apply, and I was fortunate to make it through that process. It did allow me the opportunity to return to some of my original passion around fine art and music as a funder, and still concentrating primarily on arts education and how that can make a huge impact in young people's lives. But the medium of the arts for me is really inspiring.
Yeah, and having known you for many years, the work that you've done in those various spheres has been really critical and essential to the wonderful things going on in Pittsburgh. Because City of Bridges is an educational institution, one of the things that we always wonder about is what are the learning experiences that people have on their paths. So were there one or two essential learning experiences on that journey that you just laid out that were really critical?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I guess I could easily pick some from early in my growth and development, which might really apply to a high school person's experience. But I, for many years, went to a summer camp and attended the camp, and then grew up through its leadership ranks, and had a really powerful experience just in terms of trusting other people on a fairly intense backcountry hike. At one point, I was probably 19 years old, and responsible for leading a hike that included, I think, 8 or 10 boys who were, I think, 13 or 14 years old. And the extent of the range hike that we were doing was so intense and ambitious, and also unmapped. So there was a lot of bushwhacking. It took us quite a bit longer to actually make this enormous loop in what was called the Seward Range in the Adirondacks. And we made the circuit of the loop, but upon descending, we'd run out of daylight. And so the experience there that was really the powerful learning experience for me was about trusting in the kind of the ability for a group to sustain itself, to sort of utilize one another's strengths in order to make it through a challenging. This was actually ended up being, fortunately, no one was hurt, but it was a frightening experience, so it both gave me a level of confidence to be able to say I'm in charge and responsible for a group of younger people, and I need to keep my cool, and also provide some opportunities for other young people in the group to take a leadership role. So there was a junior counselor, essentially, right in between the 13-year-olds and myself at 19. He was probably 16 at the time, but gave him the opportunity to lead the group, where I pulled up the rear so that we wouldn't lose anybody. But it was absolutely pitch dark, and we had to navigate our way back through some trails, but trails that we did not have adequate light to see on. So we made it back safe, but probably after about 12 hours of hiking. So just learning how to work with that group dynamic for me was a real, when people ask me about meaningful turning points in my life, like that particular experience is very distilled. I would have to say that later, some of my professional learning experiences also had to do with working with other people, but they ended up being more about how to communicate, essentially learning how to say no in ways that were still supportive and still provided opportunities to get to another form of yes. And so while I've had dozens and dozens of these particular experiences, I would actually just say the practice of being in this was mostly at the Sprout Fund, but being in a situation where funding decisions had to be made, people came to us with their ideas. It's a relatively vulnerable move to share your idea and to expect or hope that you're rewarded with some sort of funding. And the reality is we chose far fewer projects to fund than we could then actually applied. So I was often saying no, and learning how to say no while providing a referral or an opportunity to say, hey, we may not have been able to do this, but your idea has merit in the following ways. Here are some people I can introduce you to, or here's another opportunity that might come along. And I learned that both by practicing it and having some positive outcomes. I also made a couple of mistakes along the way, and frankly, came up against a few times when I was challenged to tell somebody maybe why they were not chosen for funding, and I didn't always have the right answer. That also helped me to recognize the very different position I had as the person in a decision-making capacity, having the power in that dynamic, and wanting to make sure that I was mindful of how I wielded that. So those have been major, and I continue to learn that process. So that's an evolving process. Yes. It's one thing to take a walk in the woods and come back safe. I think it's another thing to kind of maintain positive relationships in the community, and also recognize that you're not always going to have the right answer, and sometimes need to just work through that. Yeah,
that's a lesson for all of us, and certainly is in our sort of high school years. That's one that can be a tricky one, but for sure, well worth learning. So looking back on this, and still being a young and vivacious person, where might you imagine your path taking you next?
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly excited for all the work that's ahead of me at the Heinz Endowments, and I'm relatively new there, and so the work that I'm looking forward to certainly has a lot to do with creating a greater sense of and authentic, really, access to high-quality arts education for young people who have historically really not had that level of access, and moreover, have in recent history in the past 20 or 30 years sort of been systemically shut out of really great high-quality arts opportunities in the public schools. And so I think that there's opportunities specifically with my work at the Heinz Endowments to change the equation on where and when young people can experience creativity, and they can use their creativity to develop as whole people. So very much looking forward to that. Yeah. But I think in the long run, I hope to do something different. In all honesty, I want to keep doing this kind of work. I'm in service to the institution of the endowments, but that won't last forever. And I'm certainly hoping that in many ways, I hope that I can do something a little bit more with my hands as a craftsman and a creator. I only practice those things as a hobby, and I would like at some point in my life to return to more whole, more completely working with my hands, building things and repairing things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mac, for spending a few minutes with us today. We all make the road by walking, and hearing the path that you have walked has been really great as a friend and as an educator. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Randy. Yeah.